At my grandmother's funeral, my uncle smirked and said, "I already emptied her safe deposit box. There's nothing left for you." I thought he had won until the lawyer smiled and said, "Actually, you took the wrong box." When the truth came out, my uncle's face went pale. I stood by my grandmother's casket, my hands clenched into fists. I should have been grieving, reminiscing about all the good times we had together, but instead, I was staring at my uncle, his smug face, his tailored black suit that screamed arrogance, and that little smirk on his lips that made my blood boil. He leaned in, just close enough so only I could hear him, and whispered, "I already emptied her safe deposit box. There's nothing left for you." Then he walked away like he had just won the lottery. For a moment, I couldn't even react. My body went cold. My grandmother had worked her whole life to build what she had. She wasn't a billionaire, but she was careful. She had saved, invested, and, most of all, she had been smart about her money. She always told me, "When the time comes, I'll make sure you're taken care of." And now, my uncle, the man who had barely even visited her in her last years, was gloating about robbing her before she was even in the ground. Now, let me back up a little. My grandmother had 3 children, my mother, my aunt, and my uncle. My mom was always the responsible one, the one who took care of my grandmother when she got older. My aunt wasn't a bad person, just kind of distant, never caused problems but never got involved either. But my uncle? He was different. He had always been selfish, always looking for an angle, always trying to take more than his share. He married rich, then divorced richer, spent money like it was water, and had that kind of entitlement that made him think he deserved everything. When my grandmother's health started failing, my mom was the one who took care of her. She drove her to doctor's appointments, handled her bills, made sure she had everything she needed. My uncle? He only showed up when he thought there was something in it for him. And now, at her funeral, he was acting like he had won. The funeral ended, and everyone started heading to the reception. I stayed back, trying to process everything. That's when my grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, walked up to me. He was an older man, someone my grandmother had trusted for decades. He had that calm, knowing expression on his face, the kind that made me think he knew something my uncle didn't. He glanced over at my uncle, then back at me, and said, "Actually, he took the wrong box." My head snapped up. "What?" He smiled. "Your grandmother knew how he was. She had 2 safe deposit boxes. One was a decoy." It took me a second to process what he was saying. "So he stole the fake one?" Thompson nodded. "Everything in there was meant to throw him off, worthless old documents, some fake stock certificates, and a handful of old coins that aren't worth anything." I felt a slow, creeping satisfaction building in my chest. "And the real one?" He handed me a small envelope. "The details are in here, but let's just say he's in for a surprise when he tries to cash in on what he stole." I almost laughed right then and there, but I didn't. No, I wanted to see how this played out, so I waited. It didn't take long. A few days later, my uncle started bragging about all the things he was planning to do now that he had secured my grandmother's wealth. He was talking about vacations, investments, even a new house. Then he tried to cash in, and that's when the truth hit him like a freight train. I didn't have to wait long to hear the fallout. A few days later, my cousin, my uncle's only son, called me, his voice tight with frustration. "Have you seen my dad?" he asked. "No." "Why?" I said, though I already had a feeling. "He's losing it." He sighed. "He went to the bank today to cash in some of Grandma's old stocks and bonds, and they told him they were worthless." I almost choked trying to hold back my laugh. "Wait, what?" I said, playing dumb. "Yeah," he said. "He's screaming at his lawyer right now. Something about how he was supposed to get everything." I could only imagine the scene. My uncle, who had spent years thinking he was the smartest person in the room, was now realizing he had robbed himself, while my uncle was busy figuring out that he had stolen a box full of useless papers. I sat down with Mr. Thompson to go over what my grandmother had really left behind. He slid a folder across the table. "Your grandmother knew your uncle would try something," he said, "so she made sure everything was airtight." I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the neatly typed words. My grandmother had divided everything, her house, her savings, her investments, but she had left something specific just for me, a separate trust, one he couldn't touch, one that held something far more valuable than just money. My heart pounded as I flipped through the pages. It was ownership of a large piece of land she had bought decades ago. It didn't seem like much back then, just some open space outside of town, but now? Now it was worth millions. The moment my uncle found out, he lost it. He called me, screaming, demanding to know how I had tricked Grandma into leaving me something. "You stole from me," he shrieked. I let out a slow breath. "I didn't steal anything. You took the wrong box. Remember?" His voice cracked. "But I was supposed to get everything." "That's not how it works," I said. "Grandma knew exactly what she was doing." He hung up on me. That was just the beginning. A few days later, my uncle's problems got worse. Turns out, when he emptied that decoy box, He had unknowingly committed bank fraud. See, my grandmother had put a few fake legal documents in there, nothing illegal, but just official looking enough to make him think he was getting something valuable. He had forged her signature on a few of them, trying to claim assets that weren't even hers. And the bank? They didn't take that lightly. Before he knew it, he was under investigation. The final blow? The last time I saw my uncle, he was a wreck. His lawyer had dropped him. His accounts were frozen, and he had lost everything he thought he had stolen. The worst part? He knew I had won. He knew my grandmother had outsmarted him. He knew he had played himself. I didn't gloat. I didn't even need to. The look on his face was enough. And as I walked away, I could almost hear my grandmother's voice in my head, chuckling softly. Some people never learn. I thought that was the end of it. I really did. But my uncle? He wasn't the type to accept defeat. A few weeks later, I got a notice in the mail. He was suing me. He claimed my grandmother had been manipulated in her final years, that I had somehow tricked her into changing her will. He wanted the trust overturned, the land seized, and everything redistributed. I wasn't worried. My grandmother had done everything legally, but I was angry. After everything, after he had stolen from his own mother, he still had the audacity to try to take more. His lawsuit should have been thrown out immediately, but here's the thing, lawsuits cost money, and my uncle still had some left. Not much, but enough to make my life hell for a while. He dragged it out, filing motion after motion, trying to delay things, trying to find some loophole. But here's where it gets really good. While my uncle was busy suing me, something else was happening behind the scenes. He had been living a very expensive life for years, big houses, luxury cars, designer clothes. He always acted like money was endless, but it wasn't. Turns out, after his divorce, he had been secretly drowning in debt. He had borrowed against everything he had, maxed out lines of credit, and taken out shady private loans. And now? Now his lawsuit had drawn attention to his real financial situation. Creditors started knocking. The IRS started looking into him. Then the real kicker, his ex-wife sued him, claiming he had hidden assets during their divorce. His life was unraveling faster than he could keep up. And then, the final twist. Remember the land my grandmother left me? The one my uncle thought was worthless? Well, he really should have done his research. Because what he didn't know was that my grandmother had been working on a deal for years. A development company had been negotiating to buy the land. They had big plans, commercial real estate, luxury homes, retail space, and just a few weeks after my uncle's lawsuit started, the deal closed. The trust my grandmother set up for me? It wasn't just worth millions. It was worth tens of millions. When my uncle found out, he lost what little sanity he had left. He tried to add to the lawsuit, claiming that the land deal had been hidden from him. But the judge? He wasn't buying it. Not only did my uncle lose the lawsuit, he was ordered to pay all of my legal fees. With no money left, my uncle was forced to sell his house. His cars were repossessed. His credit was destroyed. And the best part? The bank fraud investigation was still ongoing. He went from living in a mansion to renting a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town. He was completely, utterly ruined. The last I heard, he was trying to start some kind of business selling luxury lifestyle coaching or some nonsense, but no one was buying it. And me? I was set for life, all because my grandmother knew exactly who he was. He thought he had won, but in the end, he only outsmarted himself. For a while, I thought that was it. My uncle was broke, humiliated, and trapped in the mess he created. But some people don't know when to quit. Even after losing everything, he kept trying to fight. He started telling anyone who would listen that I had stolen the inheritance. He tried to play the victim, claiming I had manipulated our grandmother into cutting him out. At first, I ignored it, let him talk. No one believed him. But then he did something that crossed the line. He showed up at my grandmother's old house, the one I inherited, and tried to break in. I got a call from the security company in the middle of the night. There's been a break-in attempt, the guy said. The police are on the way. I didn't even have to ask who it was. By the time I got there, the cops had already arrived. My uncle was standing in the driveway, screaming at the officers, trying to convince them he had a right to be there. "This is my mother's house," he shrieked. One of the officers turned to me. "Sir, do you know this man?" I crossed my arms. "Unfortunately," the officer sighed. "He claims he has a right to the property." I pulled out my phone, opened an email from the lawyer, and showed them the legal deed with my name on it. "He has no right to anything," I said. The cop looked at the paper, nodded, then turned to my uncle. "Sir, you're trespassing," he exploded. "You don't understand. That's my inheritance. He stole it from me." The cop didn't care. "Sir, turn around. You're under arrest for trespassing and attempted burglary." I watched as they cuffed him. He was screaming, cursing, still acting like he was in control, but he wasn't. He was done. He had nothing left, no money, no lawyers, no friends willing to help. And now? Now he had a criminal record. As they put him in the back of the police car, he locked eyes with me, and for the first time, I saw it, not anger, not entitlement, fear. He knew this was the end, and I just stood there, watching, letting him feel every second of it. After that, my uncle disappeared from our lives. He lost everything, the last I heard. He was living in some rundown apartment, working odd jobs just to survive. No more luxury, no more power, no more control. And me? I honored my grandmother's memory. I took care of my mom. I made sure my family was secure. I donated to charities she cared about. I used the money the right way. And every now and then, I'd think about my uncle, how he thought he had won, how he thought he had outsmarted everyone, but in the end, he played himself. And my grandmother? She got the last laugh.